Engine roars shattered Tuesday morning's quiet, rattling windows across Miller Street. 178 Hell's Angels blocked every intersection, their heavy leather vests gleaming under the harsh sun. Neighbors locked their doors, terrified, but the towering biker leading the pack didn't come for vengeance. He came looking for Campbell. November in Denver, 1999, was brutal enough to snap tree branches under the sheer weight of ice. Campbell Ellis worked the graveyard shift at the Starlight Diner, a neon-lit relic sitting on the edge of the industrial district. At 32, Campbell carried a quiet sadness in her eyes, the kind born from a string of bad luck, a hollow marriage that had dissolved years prior, and a bank account that never quite managed to stay out of the red. The diner was her sanctuary, smelling perpetually of stale coffee, burnt cherry pie, and industrial bleach. It was past 2 in the morning when the bell above the door chimed, a weak, hesitant sound. Campbell looked up from the counter she was wiping down, expecting a weary trucker or a lost tourist. Instead, standing just inside the doorway, shivering violently, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. He wore a torn flannel shirt that was at least 3 sizes too big, no coat, and canvas sneakers completely soaked through with freezing slush. His face was smudged with dirt, but it was the dark, swelling bruise along his left cheekbone that made Campbell's heart plummet into her stomach. "Hey there, sweetheart," Campbell said, keeping her voice soft, tossing the rag aside. "We're technically closing out the kitchen, but I think I can find something warm." "You lost." The boy didn't speak. He just stared at her with wide, terrified eyes, taking a half-step backward toward the freezing darkness outside. "Wait," Campbell urged, grabbing a thick wool blanket she kept behind the register for drafts. She walked slowly, telegraphing her movements like she was approaching a frightened deer. "I won't hurt you, I promise. My name is Campbell. What's yours?" He hesitated, his teeth chattering so hard Campbell could hear them from 5 feet away. "Luke," he finally croaked, his voice raw and raspy. That night began a fragile, life-altering routine. Campbell wrapped Luke in the blanket, sat him in the back booth near the radiator, and fed him a bowl of thick chicken stew and a mountain of toast. He ate with a frantic, starved intensity that brought tears to her eyes. He wouldn't say where he came from, only that he couldn't go back. He slept in the booth until Campbell's shift ended at dawn, at which point he vanished into the alleyways before she could offer him a real bed. For 3 weeks, Luke became a ghost that only haunted the Starlight Diner. He would slip in around midnight, always bruised, always freezing, and Campbell would be waiting. She started buying him clothes, thick wool socks, a heavy winter coat, a beanie. She bought a first aid kit to carefully clean the fresh cuts on his knuckles and the scrapes on his arms. In the quiet hours of the night, while the city slept, they formed a bond. Luke drew pictures on napkins, motorcycles mostly. He told Campbell he wanted to ride far away someday, to a place where nobody could ever find him. Campbell, a woman who had given up on the idea of ever having a child, poured every ounce of maternal love she possessed into the broken boy sitting in booth 4. "You keep this," Campbell told him one evening, pressing a heavy silver compass into his small hands. It had belonged to her grandfather, the only valuable thing she owned. "So you always know how to find your way back to somewhere safe. Even if it's just here." Luke clutched the compass to his chest, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his guarded expression. But the fragile peace shattered 3 nights later. The diner doors violently swung open, crashing against the wall. A massive, staggering man with bloodshot eyes and a heavy iron wrench in his hand stormed in. It was Gary, Luke's stepfather, a local enforcer known for his violent temper and heavy debts. "Thought you could hide the little rat," Gary bellowed, his eyes locking onto Luke, who had instantly scrambled beneath the table, shaking uncontrollably. Campbell didn't think. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron coffee pot and stepped between Gary and the booth. "You get out of here right now, or I swear to God I'm calling the police." Gary laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He backhanded Campbell with such force that she flew backward, crashing into the counter. Searing pain exploded in her ribs as she hit the linoleum floor. Her vision blurred, but she could hear Luke screaming. "No, leave her alone." Luke cried out as Gary grabbed the boy by the collar of the new coat Campbell had bought him, dragging him toward the door. Campbell dragged herself up, blood trickling from her split lip, desperate to stop him. "Luke," she screamed, lunging forward, but Gary shoved her back to the ground with a heavy boot to her chest. "You come near him again, waitress, and I'll burn this diner down with you inside," Gary spat, dragging the thrashing boy out into the freezing night. Campbell called the police, but the response was painfully slow. By the time the cruisers arrived, Gary's decrepit trailer on the edge of town was completely abandoned. The police took a report. Social services were notified, but Luke was gone, swallowed entirely by the dark underbelly of the foster system and transient criminals. Campbell spent the next year frantically putting up flyers, calling agencies, and searching the streets, but Luke had simply vanished. The only thing he left behind was a crumpled napkin drawing of a motorcycle left on the table of booth 4. 25 years is a long time to carry a ghost. By the spring of 2024, Campbell Ellis was 57. Her dark hair had turned a brittle silver, and the harsh years had carved deep lines into her face. The Starlight Diner was now hers. She had bought it for a song when the previous owner passed away, but ownership had become a curse rather than a blessing. Denver had grown, and the once-forgotten industrial district was now the prime target of aggressive gentrification. Towering luxury apartments and artisanal coffee shops were slowly suffocating the old businesses. At the center of this aggressive expansion was Amadeus Ridley, a ruthless real estate developer who operated more like a mafia boss than a businessman. Ridley owned almost every block on Miller Street, except for the Starlight Diner. Campbell was drowning. A recent bout of severe pneumonia had left her with thousands in medical debt, and the diner's roof was failing. Ridley had been circling like a vulture, offering her pennies on the dollar for the land. When Campbell flatly refused, the intimidation began. First, her supply deliveries were mysteriously cancelled. Then, the city health inspector, a man Ridley was known to play golf with, slapped the diner with aggressive, unfounded fines. Last week, 3 men in dark hoodies threw bricks through the diner's front windows at 3 in the morning, leaving behind a typed note wrapped around one of the stones: "Sell now, or lose it all anyway." The bank, manipulated by Ridley's quiet influence, had called in her commercial mortgage. She had 48 hours to produce $42,000, or the bank would foreclose, evict her, and auction the property directly to Ridley. It was a Tuesday morning. The diner was empty, the front windows boarded up with cheap plywood, casting a depressing, dim shadow over the worn linoleum. Campbell sat in booth 4, Luke's old booth, staring at a stack of eviction notices and final demands. A half-packed cardboard box sat on the table next to her. She carefully placed the old, faded napkin with the drawing of the motorcycle into a small wooden keepsake box. A single tear escaped her eye, tracking down her wrinkled cheek. She had lost. After 25 years of keeping the lights on, of hoping that maybe, just maybe, a grown-up Luke might walk through those doors looking for a hot meal, she was being forced out onto the street. Outside, the atmosphere in the city was incredibly tense. For the past 3 days, local news anchors had been speaking in hushed, nervous tones about a massive convergence on the highways. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was conducting a cross-country run. State troopers were on high alert, local businesses in neighboring towns had boarded up their windows, and police scanners were going crazy. The convoy, reportedly numbering in the hundreds, was moving straight through the heart of Denver. Campbell barely registered the news playing on the small, static-filled television above the counter. She was too busy calculating how she was going to afford a motel room for the week. At exactly 10 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. Campbell wiped her eyes quickly and forced a customer service smile, expecting Amadeus Ridley's smug lawyer arriving to deliver the final coup de grace. "I'm sorry, we're closed for—" She froze. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had been chiseled out of granite and seasoned in a war zone. He stood at least 6'4", his shoulders broad enough to block the sunlight. He wore heavy, scuffed leather boots, faded jeans, and a thick leather vest adorned with the unmistakable red and white death head patch of the Hells Angels. Tattoos crawled up his neck and down his arms. His face was obscured by a heavy, dark beard and dark sunglasses. Behind him, through the gaps in the plywood-covered windows, Campbell saw something that made her breath hitch. The street wasn't empty. It was packed. Row upon row of heavy custom Harley-Davidson motorcycles idled loudly, the rumbling vibrating through the floorboards of the diner. Huge, intimidating men in leather vests were dismounting, forming a solid, terrifying wall of muscle and chrome outside her diner. The towering biker stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He slowly took off his sunglasses. Campbell's heart pounded against her ribs. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the heavy phone behind the counter. "Look, mister, I don't have any money in the register. The place is closed. Please, just leave." The man didn't move. He stood in silence, his intense dark eyes scanning the dilapidated diner, lingering on the boarded-up windows, the water stains on the ceiling, and finally on Campbell. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the deep, thunderous idle of nearly 200 motorcycles outside. Then, very slowly, the massive biker reached into the deep inner pocket of his leather vest. Campbell braced herself, her mind flashing to weapons, to violence. Instead, he pulled out his closed fist and gently placed something on the counter. The metal clinked softly against the formica. Campbell cautiously stepped forward, her eyes darting between the man's unreadable face and the object on the counter. She looked down. Sitting under the dim, flickering fluorescent light was a heavy, antique silver compass. It was badly scratched, dented on one side, and the glass was cracked. But Campbell recognized the intricate engraving of a rising sun on the lid instantly. It was her grandfather's compass. Campbell gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. The world seemed to spin violently. She looked back up at the towering, terrifying man, searching his hardened, scarred face. Beneath the thick beard, beneath the heavy brow and the intimidating presence, she saw a faint, jagged scar resting high on his left cheekbone. "Luke," Campbell whispered, her voice trembling so violently it barely made a sound. The giant biker's hardened expression completely broke. His eyes, suddenly bright with unshed tears, softened into a look of profound, desperate relief. "You told me it would always help me find my way back to somewhere safe," Luke said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that cracked with emotion. "It took me a while, Campbell, but I found my way back." Campbell's hands trembled so violently she had to grip the edge of the formica counter just to stay on her feet. The towering, leather-clad man before her, a man who looked capable of bending steel with his bare hands, was the same bruised, terrified boy she had hidden in Booth 4 a lifetime ago. Tears finally spilled over Campbell's eyelashes, cutting through the dust and exhaustion on her face. Without thinking about the intimidating patches on his vest, or the army of bikers idling outside, she stepped around the counter and threw her arms around his massive torso. Luke let out a shuddering breath and returned the embrace, wrapping his heavily tattooed arms around her fragile shoulders, burying his face in her silver hair. For a long minute, the harsh realities of the foreclosure, the broken windows, and the ruthless developer outside simply ceased to exist. When they finally parted, Luke gently guided Campbell to booth 4. He slid into the opposite side, the leather of his vest creaking. He looked around the diner, his eyes lingering on the faded linoleum and the water stains on the ceiling. "I tried to find you," Luke said, his voice thick with unspent emotion. "After Gary dragged me out, social services put me in a group home in Nevada. I ran away when I was 15, lived on the streets, bounced around. But I kept the compass." He tapped the silver antique resting on the table. "Every time I thought about giving up, every time the streets got too cold or the people got too mean, I looked at it. I remembered that someone once thought I was worth saving." Luke explained the turbulent years that followed. He had found discipline in the military, serving 2 tours overseas, but when he returned, the civilian world felt alien and cold. He found his true family on the road, joining the Hells Angels. The brotherhood gave him the structure and loyalty he had been starved of his entire life. Over the past decade, he had risen through the ranks, eventually becoming the president of a prominent West Coast charter. "But I never stopped looking for the starlight," Luke continued, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Problem was, I only knew your first name. And when I finally sent a prospect to Denver 5 years ago, this whole district was being torn down. The county records were a mess. It wasn't until last week, when the public foreclosure notices hit the county clerk's office, that my lawyer spotted the name Campbell Ellis attached to the Starlight Diner property." Luke's expression hardened, the emotional warmth instantly replaced by a chilling, predatory focus. He looked at the half-packed cardboard box on the table, then at the eviction notices Campbell had been sorting through. "Who is doing this to you, Campbell?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with quiet menace. Campbell sighed, rubbing her tired eyes. "It's a developer, Amadeus Ridley. He wants the land to build luxury condos. When I refused to sell, he made sure the bank called in my commercial mortgage early. I owe $42,000 by tomorrow morning, Luke. If I don't have it, the bank forecloses and they auction it directly to Ridley. He also..." She hesitated, glancing at the plywood covering the windows. "He sent men to throw bricks through the windows last week. To scare me out." The silence that followed was suffocating. Luke didn't yell. He didn't slam his fists on the table. Instead, a terrifying absolute stillness washed over him. He slowly reached out, picked up the eviction notice, and read the bank's address and Amadeus Ridley's corporate letterhead. Luke stood up. He walked to the door and pushed it open, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. Campbell followed nervously behind him, standing on the diner's threshold. 178 Hells Angels were waiting in the street. The moment Luke stepped out, the low rumble of conversation ceased. The silence of nearly 200 hardened men was deafening. Luke raised a hand, signaling a burly man with a thick grey beard and a vice president patch to approach. "Break," Luke said, his voice carrying clearly down the block. "The woman who saved my life is being forced out of her home." A suit named Amadeus Ridley used his leverage at the First National Bank downtown to call in her mortgage. 42 grand. He also sent thugs to put bricks through her windows. Nah. A collective, ominous murmur rippled through the sea of leather and chrome. Jaws tightened, fists clenched. "Get Harrison up here," Luke commanded. A moment later, a man steps through the crowd. Unlike the others, he wore a crisp, tailored suit underneath his leather cut. Harrison was the club's legal counsel, a brilliant attorney who rode a custom Softail and possessed a ruthless understanding of corporate loopholes. "We're going to the bank," Luke told Harrison, his eyes burning with cold fury. "And then we're going to have a polite conversation with Mr. Ridley. We are going to settle Campbell's debt. Legally. Airtight. But we're going to make sure Ridley understands that this diner is under new management." Luke turned back to Campbell, a fierce protective light in his eyes. "Make a pot of coffee, Campbell. You're not packing a single box. We'll be back in an hour." Before Campbell could protest, Luke swung a heavy leg over his massive motorcycle. The engine roared to life, a deafening explosion of horsepower. As 178 engines fired up, shaking the very foundations of Miller Street. Campbell watched, a hand pressed to her heart as the massive steel cavalry rolled out, a tidal wave of leather and roaring exhaust heading straight for the financial district. Amadeus Ridley sat in his sprawling, glass-walled office on the 20th floor of the downtown Ridley Towers, admiring the panoramic view of the city he was systematically conquering. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, treating Denver like a personal chessboard. The Starlight Diner was the final pawn standing in the way of his multi-million-dollar development project. By tomorrow it would be his. He was pouring himself a glass of expensive scotch when he felt it. A low, rhythmic vibration pulsing through the soles of his Italian leather shoes. It felt like a minor earthquake. Ridley frowned, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked down at the street below and froze, the crystal blast slipping from his fingers and shattering against the hardwood floor. The entire block surrounding his corporate building was completely gridlocked. Hundreds of heavy motorcycles were parked in absolute terrifying precision, completely surrounding the building's exits. Men in leather vests were standing shoulder to shoulder, an impenetrable wall of muscle blocking the sidewalks. Pedestrians had fled. The police, heavily outnumbered and unsure of what laws were technically being broken, were parked a block away, simply watching the perimeter. Ridley's intercom buzzed frantically. "Mr. Dopp." "Ridley," his receptionist shrieked, her voice thick with panic. There are men coming up the elevator." Security tried to stop them, but they just walked right past the guards. The heavy oak doors of Ridley's office swung open before he could reply. Luke walked in, his massive frame making the spacious office suddenly feel claustrophobic. Harrison walked in beside him, carrying a sleek metal briefcase. Two more heavily tattooed angels stood by the door, crossing their arms, their expressions utterly blank. "Amadeus Ridley," Luke said, his gravelly voice echoing off the glass walls. It wasn't a greeting, it was a verdict. Ridley swallowed hard, his arrogant facade crumbling instantly. Who are you?" "I'll call the police." "You can't just barge in here." "You can call the police," Harrison interrupted smoothly, stepping forward and placing the briefcase on Ridley's mahogany desk. "But they are going to be very interested in the sworn affidavits I have in this folder." Harrison popped the latches on the briefcase and opened it. Inside, stacked perfectly, were bundles of $100 bills. Exactly $42,000. Beside the cash was a thick manila folder. "We just came from the First National Bank," Harrison explained, adjusting his glasses. "We paid off the commercial mortgage for the property known as the Starlight Diner, owned by Campbell Ellis. The debt is cleared. The title is free and clear. You will not be foreclosing on anything tomorrow." Ridley stared at the cash, his face flushing with a mix of anger and terror. You can't do this. That property is zoned for my development. She's a nuisance to the district." Luke crossed the room in two massive strides, planting his heavy boots right in front of Ridley. He leaned down, placing his scarred hands flat on the desk, bringing his face inches from the developers. "Let me explain how this works from now on, Amadeus," Luke growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated in Ridley's chest. "You sent 3 men to throw bricks through Campbell's windows. You thought you could terrorize an old woman who had nobody to protect her." Luke tapped the manila folder. "My brothers tracked down the 3 junkies you hired. They were very cooperative. They gave us your name, the burner phone number you used, and the exact amount you paid them. We have it all documented right there. Conspiracy to commit property damage, intimidation, and extortion." Ridley went entirely pale, sinking into his leather executive chair. "Here is the new deal," Luke whispered, his dark eyes boring into Ridley's soul. "You are going to take your development project, and you are going to build it somewhere else. You are never going to step foot on Miller Street again. You will never look at the Starlight Diner. You will never even say the name Campbell Ellis. If she gets a parking ticket she didn't deserve, if her power flickers for a second too long, if a single stray dog barks at her the wrong way, I am going to assume you had something to do with it. And I will come back with a lot more than a briefcase. Luke stood up to his full, terrifying height. Do we have an understanding? Ridley, trembling uncontrollably, could only nod in frantic submission. Good, Luke said, turning on his heel. Leave the cash, Harrison. He can use it to pay his contractors for the delays. I know why you... An hour later, Campbell was sitting in booth 4, a fresh cup of coffee trembling in her hands. The roar of the engines returned, shaking the windows. The door opened and Luke walked in, a triumphant, gentle smile breaking through his thick beard. He walked over and placed the official stamped deed to the Starlight Diner flat on the table, right next to the silver compass. It's yours, Campbell, Luke said softly. Free and clear. Nobody is ever taking this place from you. Campbell covered her mouth, fresh tears streaming down her face. She tried to speak, to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. We're not done, Luke added, looking around the diner. The guys noticed the roof is sagging in the back, and the plumbing in the kitchen sounds like a dying tractor. The club is sticking around Denver for the next week. We've got carpenters, plumbers, and electricians in the charter. We're fixing this place up. True to his word, the next 7 days on Miller Street were unlike anything the city had ever seen. The 178 Hells Angels didn't just leave, they went to work. Massive men in leather cuts could be seen on the roof of the Starlight Diner, tearing up old shingles and laying down new tar. They replaced the shattered front windows with reinforced glass, rewired the ancient electrical system, and gave the entire interior a fresh coat of paint. The community, initially terrified by the biker gang's presence, watched in awe as the feared men completely restored the beloved diner. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting footage of the towering bikers carrying lumber and sharing cherry pie at the counter. The negative stigma evaporated, replaced by genuine amazement. By the end of the week, the Starlight Diner looked better than it had in 50 years. The neon sign buzzed brightly, casting a warm glow over the newly paved parking lot. On their final morning in Denver, the club gathered outside for one last goodbye. Campbell stood on the porch, wiping her eyes with an apron. She had cooked breakfast for nearly 200 men that morning, a chaotic, beautiful symphony of eggs, bacon, and laughter. Luke walked up the steps and pulled Campbell into a tight, bear-like hug. You don't have to worry about a thing anymore, Luke whispered in her ear. He pulled back and pointed to the diner's front door. Screwed securely into the wood above the handle was a small, discreet metal plaque bearing the winged death head logo of the Hells Angels. This diner is officially under the protection of the club, Luke said loud enough for the street to hear. Any charter anywhere in the country riding through Denver knows that this is a safe haven, and anyone who tries to mess with it messes with all of us. Campbell smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in decades. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the antique silver compass, pressing it back into Luke's massive hand. I don't need this to find my way anymore, Campbell said softly, her eyes shining. I know exactly where I am. You keep it, Luke. For the road, Luke closed his fingers around the cool metal, a single tear escaping his sunglasses. He nodded, unable to speak, and walked back to his motorcycle. As the thunderous roar of 178 engines echoed through the canyons of the city, Campbell Ellis stood on her freshly painted porch, watching her boy ride off into the sunrise, knowing that no matter how dark the world got, she would never, ever be alone again. If Campbell and Luke's incredible journey moved you, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends to spread a little hope today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on more true, heartwarming stories of unexpected heroes and life-changing reunions. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Campbell's shoes?